One man rose, with ambition, genius, and an entire continent as his battlefield.
This is not a story of glory. This is a story of the price.
At the end of the 18th century, Europe did not enter the age of Napoleon with the sound of triumphant trumpets, but with the slow cracking of an old order rotting from within. Courts that had long believed their power to be eternal began to falter under waves of social unrest, financial collapse, and new ideas about popular sovereignty. At the center of this seismic shift stood France, where the French Revolution did more than overthrow a dynasty. It shattered the traditional limits of war, the state, and the value of human life itself. Slogans of liberty and equality echoed through the squares of Paris, but behind them lay violence, terror, and a society learning to survive under a permanent state of emergency. It was within this vacuum of authority that one man emerged, not as a philosopher or reformer, but as the perfect product of a new kind of modern warfare taking shape. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born at the center of power, but on Corsica, a contested borderland shaped by conflict and uncertain identity. When France descended into revolutionary chaos, Napoleon did not see ideals. He saw opportunity. The Revolutionary Army, severed from the old aristocratic hierarchy, became one of the few remaining paths of advancement in a society that was dismantling its traditional social order. Talent and ambition could now replace lineage. Napoleon rose quickly, not because he embodied freedom, but because he understood war as a total equation, where speed, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives could purchase control over an entire continent. The early years of the revolutionary regime transformed France into a nation permanently mobilized. For the first time in European history, war was no longer the domain of small professional armies. It became a project of society itself. Massive armies crossed borders, carrying not only weapons, but revolutionary ideas that terrified neighboring monarchies. Within this environment, Napoleon learned to command human masses on an unprecedented scale, to coordinate logistics across entire regions, and above all, to treat human losses as acceptable variables. This was not spontaneous cruelty, but a cold logic forged in an era where victory was measured by maps changing color. By the time Napoleon seized power, Europe was already exhausted by revolutionary war, yet wholly unprepared for what was to come. The dynasties of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain believed they were facing a temporary usurper, a brilliant but ultimately limited general. They failed to recognize that Napoleon's system of warfare, built on mobile corps, rapid strikes, deep penetration, and the destruction of enemy forces before they could fully assemble, had rendered traditional warfare obsolete. His campaigns were not designed merely to defeat armies, but to shatter political will, forcing governments to sue for peace in a state of psychological collapse. Behind the celebrated victories, however, lay another reality. Europe was slowly transformed into a continuous battlefield, without pause or relief. Cities were occupied, rural regions drained to sustain armies, and an entire generation of young men was pulled into a war machine with no clear end. For ordinary people, Napoleon's rule did not appear as military genius, but as an endless cycle of conscription, taxation, and funerals. The victory maps drawn in Paris were paid for with ruined villages in Italy, Germany, Spain, and later, Russia. Napoleon saw himself as the bringer of order to a chaotic Europe, yet that order rested on systematic violence. His legal codes, administrative reforms, and structures of power were inseparable from the battlefields where hundreds of thousands fell. Each victory opened a new front. Each peace treaty became only a pause before the next conflict. Europe entered a loop of war in which peace ceased to be a goal, and instead became a brief interval between mobilizations. This opening chapter is not a triumphal overture, but the moment when a single individual and an entire continent slid together into the logic of total war. Napoleon did not arise in a moral vacuum. He was the product of an age that had accepted the belief that history itself could be accelerated through violence. And once that wheel began to turn, it crushed not only his enemies, but Europe itself, layer by layer, generation after generation, through more than a decade of relentless bloodshed. If Part 1 marked the moment Europe began sliding into total war, then Part 2 tells the story of how one man learned to control that machinery, refine it, and ultimately turn it into an extension of his own will. To understand Napoleon's rise, one cannot begin with crowns or coronations, but with a period of profound instability, when power itself had not yet taken a stable form and human life had become cheaper than political certainty. Napoleon entered history not through a single great victory, but through calculated patience during the most violent phases of the French Revolution. As senior commanders were purged, suspected, or executed, the French army found itself dangerously short of experienced leadership. In this vacuum, young officers unburdened by aristocratic lineage were suddenly entrusted with unprecedented authority. Napoleon quickly understood that in a society where laws shifted by the month, only military force could offer even temporary stability. The campaign that shaped his understanding of warfare did not unfold on the famous plains of Central Europe, but in Italy, where he was given command of an underfunded, poorly supplied, and demoralized army considered secondary by Paris. It was here that Napoleon discovered a principle that would define his career. War was not simply a contest of numbers, but of speed, surprise, and psychological pressure. He divided his forces, moved rapidly, struck at enemy weaknesses, and forced Austrian and Allied armies into constant reaction. Victory came not through superiority of strength, but through keeping opponents perpetually one step behind. Battles such as Arcole and Réville brought Napoleon more than military success. They gave him something equally valuable: control over narrative. In Paris, he was celebrated as the embodiment of revolutionary military genius, while the civilian government of the Directory sank deeper into corruption and paralysis. This contrast was no accident. Napoleon understood that military authority, when carefully presented, could eclipse questions of legitimacy. He sent home not only reports of victory, but paintings, proclamations, and curated stories, where defeats were softened and casualties pushed beyond the frame. Yet war was never only spectacle. In Italy, every advance of the French army was accompanied by occupation, requisition, and social upheaval. Churches were stripped of wealth, cities were forced to sustain occupying troops, and local populations quickly realized that revolutionary ideals carried a heavy price. Napoleon did not view this as a moral dilemma, but as a strategic necessity. In his view, a successful campaign was one that fed itself from conquered territory, regardless of long-term consequences for civilian life. During this period, Napoleon learned how to wield war as a political instrument. Each treaty signed in Italy weakened Europe's traditional powers, while strengthening his personal position at home. As the Directory became increasingly dependent on the army to maintain order, the boundary between civilian authority and military power began to dissolve. Napoleon did not need to overthrow the government by force. He merely needed to ensure that it could not function without him. His return to Paris marked a transformation. He was no longer simply a general, but a political figure shaped by the realities of mass warfare. He had seen how fear and exhaustion could make a population accept concentrations of power that would have been unthinkable only years earlier. In this climate, the question was no longer whether Napoleon sought power, but whether a war-weary France was capable of refusing a man who promised order at any cost. Part 2 ends at this threshold. Napoleon stands between two worlds, the fading ideals of revolution and the path toward absolute authority, paved by military success. The lessons he learned in Italy about speed, perception, and the expendability of human life as a strategic variable would soon be applied on a far greater scale, shaping the wars that would drown Europe in blood for more than a decade to come. If Part 2 ended with Napoleon standing at the threshold of power, then Part 3 is the story of how he crossed it not through open rebellion, but through the quiet exhaustion of an entire nation. By the late 1790s, France was no longer intoxicated by revolution. It was weary. The public no longer debated liberty and equality. They worried about the price of bread, the safety of the streets, and whether another wave of conscription was imminent. In this atmosphere, the promise of order became more seductive than any revolutionary ideal. Napoleon understood this mood with precision. After his Italian victories, he returned to Paris not merely as a successful general, but as a symbol of control in an age of chaos. His presence carried reassurance. While political institutions staggered under corruption and paralysis, he appeared decisive, disciplined, and effective. When the coup of 18 Brumaire unfolded, it did not erupt as a violent uprising, but as a carefully orchestrated maneuver within the halls of power. Legislators were intimidated, isolated, and ultimately persuaded that surrendering authority to the military, specifically to Napoleon, was the only way to prevent total collapse. The establishment of the consulate did not mark the end of the French Republic, but its transformation into a new form of centralized rule. On paper, republican institutions survived. In practice, power flowed steadily toward a single individual, shielded by constitutions, plebiscites, and legal formalities designed to project consent. Napoleon did not abandon the language of the revolution. He repurposed it. Stability, security, and national salvation became the justifications for the concentration of authority. During this period, Napoleon began constructing a state that functioned like a war machine even in peacetime. Administration was reorganized to maximize efficiency and taxation. Law was standardized to enforce discipline and predictability. The army became not merely a tool of defense, but the backbone of internal order. For many French citizens, this was not perceived as betrayal, but as relief. After a decade of upheaval, peace seemed worth the price of political submission. For the rest of Europe, however, this consolidation signaled something far more ominous. France had found a stable center of power capable of sustaining war on an unprecedented scale. At the same time, Napoleon remained deeply bound to war as a source of legitimacy. The Egyptian campaign, despite its strategic failure, played a critical role in shaping his public image. Paintings and proclamations depicted him amid deserts and ancient monuments, presenting him as a conqueror who transcended Europe itself. These images concealed abandoned troops, naval defeats, and diplomatic isolation. In Napoleon's world, defeat could be survived so long as perception was controlled. Behind the spectacle, however, lay a darker reality. With power increasingly concentrated in one man, decisions of war and peace were no longer subject to meaningful restraint. There were no institutions strong enough to prevent conflict if Napoleon believed it necessary for stability or prestige. Europe, which had only briefly emerged from the violence of revolutionary war, now stood on the brink of a new era, one in which conflict would be waged not in the name of revolution, but in the name of order. Part 3 ends at this central contradiction. Napoleon delivered what France most desired: stability. Yet that stability rested on absolute personal authority and a society conditioned to accept military solutions to political problems. The road to empire did not begin with a crown, but with a collective willingness to believe that peace could only be achieved through strength, and that one man, if powerful enough, could replace an entire system. As France entered the 19th century, the so-called New Order revealed its true nature. The stability Napoleon promised did not lead to lasting peace. It opened the path to a more ambitious and far more destructive form of war. From his position as first consul, Napoleon no longer concealed his ultimate objective. Power, once concentrated, seeks its highest form of legitimacy. In 1804, that legitimacy took the shape of a crown. The coronation at Notre Dame was not merely a political or religious ceremony. It was a declaration to all of Europe. By placing the crown upon his own head, Napoleon asserted that his authority came neither from tradition nor from the church, but from victory itself and from a society accustomed to being ruled by force. In that moment, an empire was born, one that did not inherit the past, but reorganized it around the will of a single individual. To Europe's monarchies, this was more than an insult. It was a warning that France was prepared to impose its vision of order across the continent. War returned almost immediately, this time on a scale and with an intensity Europe had never experienced. Coalitions formed not to defend ideals, but to contain an empire expanding at terrifying speed. Napoleon, now emperor, reshaped warfare itself. His armies moved as semi-independent corps, striking quickly, penetrating deeply, and destroying enemy forces before they could fully assemble. Victory no longer meant merely winning battles, it meant collapsing political systems. The campaign that culminated in Austerlitz became the purest expression of this approach, a single decisive blow that shattered both armies and the diplomatic structures behind them. In the aftermath, Europe's map began to change with breathtaking speed. States were forced into treaties, territories were ceded, and rulers were replaced with regimes loyal to Paris. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire marked not only the end of a political entity that had endured for centuries, but the extent to which Napoleon's wars had torn apart Europe's traditional foundations. The continent was no longer a mosaic of inherited dynasties. It was being reorganized according to military efficiency and administrative control. Yet the empire was not without limits. At sea, Napoleon confronted an enemy he could not defeat by maneuver or speed. Britain's naval supremacy blocked his ambitions beyond the continent, a reality laid bare by the destruction of the French fleet. Unable to strike across the water, Napoleon turned to economic warfare, seeking to isolate Britain through a continent-wide blockade. But this strategy inflicted damage not only on his enemy, but on the very societies under his control, eroding loyalty and deepening resentment across Europe. For ordinary people, these years were not an age of glory, but of relentless mobilization. Entire generations were drawn into uniform. Cities became logistical hubs. Civilian life was reorganized around the needs of the army. Napoleon's empire depended on continuous victory to sustain itself. Without expansion, its political and economic structures began to strain. The seeds of catastrophe were already present, embedded in a system that could survive only by moving forward into ever greater conflict. Part 4 closes at the height of Napoleon's power. His empire stretched across continental Europe, seemingly unchallengeable on land. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lay fragility. Peace existed only so long as war continued to expand. Europe had been remade, but at the cost of normalizing violence on an unprecedented scale and of accepting that the fate of millions could be decided within a commander's tent. At the height of his power, Napoleon believed that Europe could be stabilized not only through battlefield victory, but through the long-term submission of conquered societies. It was here, however, that the logic of empire began to betray itself. As war became permanent and territories were reduced to components within a vast military and economic system, resistance no longer took the form of organized armies. It rose instead from everyday life. Spain would become the first place where the limits of imperial control were laid bare. Napoleon's intervention in Spain did not begin as a grand conquest. It emerged from the need to enforce the continental system, the economic blockade designed to strangle Britain. In the calculations of Paris, the Iberian Peninsula was a strategic corridor to be managed administratively and militarily. But the imposition of foreign authority, most critically the installation of Napoleon's brother, as king, shattered Spain's fragile social balance. To the local population, this was not reform. It was invasion, an assault on religion, tradition, and national dignity. The uprising in Madrid in 1808 did not unfold as a conventional military revolt. It erupted as a spontaneous response from a society pushed beyond endurance. When French forces answered with brutal repression, the conflict escalated into a cycle of vengeance that quickly escaped Napoleon's control. Roads, villages, and mountain passes became battlegrounds. The distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved. From this chaos emerged a new form of warfare: guerrilla conflict, marked by ambush, assassination, and reprisal without end. For Napoleon, Spain became a strategic nightmare. French armies could still win set-piece battles, but they could not pacify a country where every village could become an enemy stronghold. This war offered no decisive victories, no moments of resolution. Instead, it demanded constant manpower, resources, and attention. Tens of thousands of French troops were consumed year after year in a conflict that yielded no clear conclusion, even as the empire faced mounting pressures elsewhere in Europe. The brutality of the Peninsular War did more than drain military strength. It eroded the moral authority of Napoleon's empire. Collective punishments, executions, and systematic destruction transformed the image of France from liberator to occupier. Across Europe, subject peoples began to see that submission offered no guarantee of safety. Resistance, once unthinkable, now appeared possible. At home, the costs of empire became increasingly visible. Continuous mobilization reached deeper into French society, and families that had once embraced sacrifice for national glory began to question its meaning. The empire, built on the necessity of constant expansion, was discovering the danger of endless war. Victory had once sustained Napoleon's system. Now, prolonged conflict threatened to hollow it out from within. Part 5 closes in this shadowed moment. Spain was not merely another front. It was the first clear sign that Napoleon's empire could be weakened not by a single catastrophic defeat, but by countless small wounds accumulating over time. War, once the engine of expansion, had become a burden capable of undermining the very foundations of imperial power. After the slow erosion of imperial strength in Spain, Napoleon entered the new decade facing a dangerous contradiction. On paper, his authority still stretched across much of continental Europe. In reality, the empire was increasingly sustained by coercion, mass conscription, and the memory of victories that were growing harder to repeat. Within this fragile balance, relations between France and Russia became the ultimate test of the system Napoleon had built. Russia had not initially been a sworn enemy. Following earlier defeats, the Russian court accepted an uneasy partnership with France. Formally participating in the continental system meant to isolate Britain economically. But for Russia, whose economy depended heavily on trade and raw material exports, the blockade was not merely a diplomatic tool. It was a direct threat to social and economic stability. Discontent spread among nobles, merchants, and military leaders alike, eroding any commitment to French demands. Napoleon interpreted this hesitation not as strategic disagreement, but as personal defiance. The decision to invade Russia in 1812 was more than a military calculation. It was the clearest expression of Napoleon's belief that war could resolve any political problem. He assembled the Grande Armée, the largest force Europe had ever seen, drawn from across the territories under French control. In theory, it represented a unified Europe marching under a single order. In practice, it was a fragile coalition of men compelled to fight for a cause increasingly distant from their own lives. The opening phase of the campaign defied Napoleon's expectations. Russian forces refused to offer the decisive engagement he sought. Instead, they retreated steadily eastward, trading space for time. This strategy was not designed to win battles, but to exhaust the invader by drawing him deeper into vast, hostile territory. When battle finally came at Borodino, it delivered no strategic resolution, only unprecedented carnage. Napoleon held the field, but failed to destroy the Russian army. Victory, once swift and decisive, now arrived hollow and incomplete. The occupation of Moscow marked the apparent climax of the campaign and the beginning of catastrophe. The city, abandoned and burning, offered no political leverage and no surrender. Fire consumed not only buildings, but Napoleon's last hope for a negotiated end to the war. Facing a ruined city and an enemy unwilling to submit, he encountered the ultimate limit of personal power. The retreat from Russia was no longer a campaign in any conventional sense. It became a struggle for survival. Hunger, cold, disease, and relentless attacks transformed the withdrawal into a corridor of death. Hundreds of thousands perished, not in grand battles, but through exhaustion and exposure. The army that had marched east as a symbol of imperial unity dissolved into fragments of desperate survivors. The consequences rippled across Europe. Nations that had obeyed France out of fear now recognized vulnerability. New coalitions formed, not from hesitation, but from confidence that Napoleon could be defeated. In France itself, the scale of loss could no longer be concealed. Villages and cities bore the visible absence of an entire generation. Part 6 ends with the collapse of the final illusion. Napoleon remained on the throne, but the foundation of his power had been irreparably damaged. From this moment forward, the story would no longer be one of expansion, but of unraveling, each decision shaped by the shadow of a disaster that could never be undone. After the catastrophe in Russia, Europe entered a rare moment of awakening. For years, Napoleon's enemies had submitted not because they believed in his rule, but because resistance appeared futile. Now, that belief collapsed. The myth of invincibility had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored. Power that depends on fear loses its grip, the moment fear is replaced by possibility. Across the continent, states that had endured French domination began to reconsider their position. Prussia, Austria, Russia, and their allies formed what would become the Sixth Coalition, not as a desperate gamble, but as a calculated effort grounded in a new understanding of Napoleon's limits. This alliance differed from earlier attempts. Its members no longer sought quick victories or decisive battles on Napoleon's terms. Instead, they coordinated patiently, accepted temporary losses, and aimed to exhaust an empire already weakened from within. Napoleon responded with remarkable speed and determination. He rebuilt his armies with astonishing urgency, drawing heavily on young, inexperienced conscripts to replace the veterans lost in Russia. His strategic brilliance had not vanished, but the material foundation beneath it had changed. Experience gave way to numbers. Discipline gave way to haste. Victories, when achieved, were narrow and temporary, no longer capable of reshaping the broader balance of power. The decisive confrontation came in Central Europe, where the Battle of Leipzig, later remembered as the Battle of Nations, unfolded on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers converged in a single theater, transforming the battlefield into a symbol of continental exhaustion. This was no longer a contest of maneuver and surprise. It was a collision of mass armies, where attrition replaced elegance and loss was measured in tens of thousands. When Napoleon's forces finally withdrew, the message to Europe was unmistakable: the empire could be beaten. After Leipzig, the collapse accelerated. German states defected. Supply lines fractured. French authority beyond its borders dissolved with stunning speed. For the first time in more than a decade, war crossed into France itself. The conflict that had ravaged Europe now returned to its point of origin, forcing the French population to confront the consequences of a system built on perpetual warfare. In 1814, Allied armies entered Paris. There was no dramatic last stand, no apocalyptic destruction. Instead, the fall of the capital carried the cold finality of inevitability. Napoleon, isolated politically and militarily, was compelled to abdicate. His removal was not treated as a personal humiliation, but as a necessary act to end a cycle that Europe could no longer endure. Exile to Elba was intended to close the chapter. It was not revenge, but containment. Europe sought to neutralize a force that had reshaped the continent and nearly destroyed it. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's presence lingered as a reminder that the structures which enabled his rise had not vanished. Part 7 ends in this fragile moment of transition. The empire lay in ruins, but its legacy remained unresolved. Europe stood between exhaustion and uncertainty, aware that the fall of one man did not guarantee the end of the logic that had sustained him. The question was no longer whether Napoleon could return, but whether Europe itself could escape the gravitational pull of war that his era had normalized. Napoleon's fall in 1814 appeared to close one of the bloodiest chapters in European history. Exiled to Elba, stripped of his empire, and watched closely by the powers that had defeated him, he seemed neutralized. Europe turned its attention to rebuilding order, confident that the age of revolutionary and imperial war had finally passed. But history rarely ends as cleanly as diplomats hope. Napoleon's return in 1815 did not begin with invasion or mass violence. It began with hesitation. Landing on the French coast, he advanced toward Paris with no army worthy of the name, only reputation. Units sent to arrest him instead joined him. Veterans recognized a familiar figure, and the fragile legitimacy of the restored monarchy collapsed almost overnight. In those brief weeks, Europe watched in disbelief as an empire seemed to resurrect itself without a single battle. The period known as the 100 Days was not a true revival of imperial power, but a final attempt to reverse a tide that had already turned. Napoleon understood that time was no longer his ally. Europe's great powers, meeting at Vienna, did not hesitate. They had learned the cost of delay. War was declared not out of anger, but out of certainty that coexistence with Napoleon under any conditions was impossible. The final confrontation came at Waterloo. Unlike earlier triumphs, this battle offered no room for brilliance to reshape destiny. Weather, terrain, exhaustion, miscalculation, and the coordination of Allied forces combined into a situation Napoleon could not control. His enemies no longer fought him separately or impulsively. They endured, absorbed his attacks, and closed in with relentless coordination. For the first time, Napoleon faced opponents who had fully adapted to his methods. Waterloo was not the largest battle of the era, nor the most innovative. It was decisive because it left no ambiguity. When the French army broke, it did so completely. There would be no negotiated peace, no strategic pause, no opportunity for recovery. Europe had resolved not merely to defeat Napoleon, but to end the possibility of his return. This time exile meant removal from history itself. Napoleon was sent to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, chosen precisely because it lay beyond the reach of politics, myth, and memory. The intent was not punishment but erasure. A continent exhausted by war sought to ensure that no single individual could again bend its fate through personal ambition. Part 8 closes not with spectacle, but with finality. Napoleon's last gamble had failed. The age of conquest ended not in glory, but in containment. Yet even as the man was removed, the question lingered whether Europe had truly defeated the forces that had enabled his rise, or merely silenced their most powerful expression. After Waterloo, history no longer granted Napoleon moments of drama or decisive choice. It granted him time. Long, unyielding time stripped of command, stripped of audience, stripped of relevance. His exile to St. Helena was not an act of vengeance, but of absolute prevention. Europe had learned that Napoleon's true power did not lie solely in armies or titles, but in his capacity to become a symbol. To neutralize that symbol, he had to be removed not only from politics, but from the imagination of the continent. St. Helena was chosen precisely for its isolation. Remote, windswept, and far beyond the rhythms of European life, it was a place where history itself seemed to slow. At Longwood House, Napoleon lived under constant surveillance, surrounded by memories rather than power. He no longer commanded armies, but he still fought one final battle, the battle over how he would be remembered. Through conversations, dictated memoirs, and carefully shaped recollections, he attempted to transform defeat into tragedy, and ambition into destiny. His death in 1821 did not bring closure. Instead, it opened a deeper reckoning. With the man gone, Europe was forced to confront the legacy of an era defined by almost uninterrupted war. For some, Napoleon remained a military genius and a modernizer, a figure who swept away obsolete structures and imposed rational order. For others, he stood as the embodiment of endless conflict, a ruler who consumed generations in pursuit of personal grandeur. These interpretations did not cancel one another. They existed side by side, reflecting the moral ambiguity of the age itself. While Napoleon spent his final years in isolation, Europe was reconstructing its political architecture. The Congress of Vienna sought not to create an ideal peace, but a durable one. Its architects were less concerned with justice than with balance, less interested in reform than in preventing another continent-wide catastrophe. Stability became the overriding objective, even if it required suppressing the very forces of change that the Napoleonic era had unleashed. Yet Napoleon's influence could not be erased by treaties. His legal codes, administrative reforms, and military innovations endured, adopted even by former enemies. At the same time, the memory of his wars lingered as a warning etched into national consciousness, shaping how future generations viewed power, leadership, and the cost of ambition. Napoleon became both lesson and myth, both cautionary tale and object of fascination. Part 9 closes in this unresolved space. Napoleon died in exile, but the era he defined did not die with him. His shadow stretched far beyond St. Helena, into the institutions, fears, and assumptions of 19th-century Europe. The continent moved forward, but it did so carrying the weight of a memory it could neither fully reject nor fully embrace. History had removed the man. What remained was the question he left behind, whether Europe had truly learned from the blood it had shed, or whether it had merely postponed the next moment when power would once again demand war as its language. When Napoleon disappeared from the stage of history, Europe did not awaken to peace in its purest form. It awoke to exhaustion. More than 2 decades of near-continuous warfare had reshaped not only borders, but habits of thought. War had ceased to be an exception. It had become an organizing principle of political life. The silence that followed was heavy, not with relief alone, but with uncertainty about what kind of future could grow from so much destruction. In the years after Napoleon, Europe sought stability above all else. Governments spoke the language of balance, order, and restraint, determined to prevent the rise of another individual capable of dragging an entire continent into total war. Yet this pursuit of stability came at a cost. Reform was slowed, dissent was suppressed, and the memory of revolutionary change was treated as a threat rather than a possibility. Peace was preserved, but it was a cautious peace, built on fear of repetition rather than confidence in progress. Napoleon's legacy resisted simple judgment. His administrative systems endured long after his fall. Legal reforms introduced during his reign continued to shape civil life across Europe. Even states that had fought to defeat him retained elements of the order he imposed. At the same time, the human cost of his wars lingered in ways no treaty could resolve. Villages rebuilt over mass graves. Families adapted to absence. An entire generation carried the psychological imprint of endless mobilization and loss. The Napoleonic Wars also transformed how Europe understood power itself. States no longer imagined war as a limited contest between rulers. They had witnessed what happened when societies were mobilized completely, when economies, populations, and identities were harnessed for conflict. This realization did not eliminate war. It professionalized it, systematized it, and prepared the ground for even larger confrontations in the centuries to come. In memory, Napoleon became a divided figure. To some, he was a visionary who imposed rational order on chaos. To others, he was the embodiment of ambition unchecked, a warning of what happens when brilliance is allowed to eclipse restraint. These interpretations coexisted uneasily, reflecting a deeper truth that Europe itself had been both participant and victim in the age he defined. Part 10 closes not with a verdict, but with reflection. The Napoleonic era revealed how quickly societies can accept violence when order feels fragile, and how difficult it is to restore moral boundaries once they have been crossed. Napoleon did not invent this dynamic. He accelerated it, and in doing so, he left Europe with a legacy more enduring than empire, the knowledge that history can be driven forward by force, but never controlled by it. The age of Napoleon ended, but the questions it raised did not. They remained embedded in European memory, resurfacing whenever power concentrated too heavily, whenever security was promised at the expense of restraint. In that sense, the true aftermath of Napoleon was not a period of peace, but a long reckoning, one that continues to shape how societies understand war, leadership, and the fragile line between order and destruction. When the cannons finally fell silent and treaties replaced gunfire, the story of Napoleon did not end. It changed form. It moved from the battlefield into memory. What remained was not only a reshaped continent, but a Europe forced to live with the long shadow of a war that had consumed entire societies. Across cities and countryside alike, absence became the most visible legacy. Fields once trampled by armies returned to agriculture, yet beneath the soil lay the remains of men whose names were never recorded. Towns rebuilt their walls and homes, but within families, loss became permanent. The Napoleonic Wars did not conclude with victory or defeat for most people. They concluded with silence, and inherited silence passed from one generation to the next. In this quiet aftermath, Napoleon himself began to dissolve as a man and re-emerge as a symbol. Military academies studied his campaigns. Artists romanticized his image. Historians debated his genius. Yet for those who lived through the wars, the question was not how brilliant he had been, but why an entire continent had accepted nearly uninterrupted conflict as normal. The answer was uncomfortable. War had become familiar. Mobilization had become routine. Sacrifice had been normalized. Throughout the 19th century, Europe entered a period often described as stability. But it was a stability shaped by trauma. Governments feared disruption more than injustice. Balance of power mattered more than human cost. The memory of Napoleon became a justification for restraint, but also for repression. In seeking to prevent another such figure, Europe constructed systems that prized order above participation and control above trust. Yet the most dangerous legacy of the Napoleonic era was not political. It was psychological. The wars had taught Europe that entire populations could be mobilized, disciplined, and sacrificed in the name of national survival. This lesson did not disappear. It waited. Embedded in military doctrine, state bureaucracy, and collective imagination, it re-emerged in later conflicts on an even greater scale. Napoleon's true impact, then, was not limited to borders redrawn or codes enacted. It lay in the transformation of how violence was understood. War was no longer an interruption of history. It became a mechanism through which history could be forced forward. Once accepted, that idea proved difficult to abandon. Part 11 closes on this uneasy realization. Napoleon was not an anomaly standing outside his time. He was its most concentrated expression. The blood shed during his wars did not fade when peace returned. It hardened into memory, shaping how Europe approached power, security, and fear long after the empire itself had vanished. History removed the man. It did not remove the conditions that made him possible. And as long as those conditions persist, exhaustion, instability, and the promise of order at any cost, the shadow of the Napoleonic age remains, waiting to be recognized again. As time moved further away from the 19th century, Napoleon gradually ceased to exist as a historical figure and became something more abstract, a reference point, a warning, a mirror. His name no longer belonged only to archives and battle maps, but to the collective memory of a continent that had learned, at immense cost, what unrestrained power could do when fused with fear and ambition. In classrooms, museums, and books, Napoleon is often presented through the language of achievement, military innovation, administrative reform, legal order. Yet memory is not shaped solely by institutions. It is shaped by what societies choose to emphasize and what they quietly leave unspoken. Beneath the narratives of efficiency and genius lies a deeper truth, that millions of lives were consumed to sustain a vision of order that could not exist without continuous violence. The most enduring legacy of the Napoleonic era is not territorial or legal. It is conceptual. Europe learned that war could be managed, systematized, and justified as necessity. Entire populations could be mobilized, economies reorganized, and moral boundaries suspended in the name of survival and stability. This realization did not end with Napoleon. It became part of modern statecraft, reappearing whenever crisis made restraint feel like weakness. Responsibility, therefore, does not rest solely with a single man. Napoleon did not rise in isolation. He rose because societies were willing to trade participation for protection, deliberation for decisiveness, and moral uncertainty for the promise of order. His era reveals a pattern that extends beyond its time. When fear dominates public life, concentration of power becomes acceptable, even desirable. Part 12 does not ask whether Napoleon could happen again. That question misunderstands history. The more urgent question is whether the conditions that produced him still exist. Exhaustion, inequality, instability, and the belief that history can be accelerated through force are not relics of the past. They are recurring features of human society. This is where the modern world enters the story. Not as a distant observer, but as an inheritor. The Napoleonic Wars taught Europe that memory itself is a form of responsibility. To remember selectively is to risk repetition. To remember honestly is to confront the uncomfortable reality that violence often begins not with monsters, but with collective consent. Part 12 closes with a final recognition. History does not warn loudly, it whispers, it waits, and it returns when its lessons are ignored. Napoleon's era ended in exile and silence, but its questions remain unresolved. They live on wherever power promises order without accountability, and wherever societies are tempted to believe that the suffering of many can be justified by the vision of a few. In that sense, the story does not truly belong to the past. It belongs to every generation that must decide how much power it is willing to surrender, and at what cost. Long after the 19th century turned its final pages, the story of Napoleon did not conclude. It lingered, not as a sequence of events, but as a pattern, quiet, persistent, and difficult to escape. History moved forward, yet it carried with it the habits, assumptions, and reflexes forged during the age of total war. In the generations that followed, Europe told itself that it had learned. Empires fell, constitutions were written. Balance replaced conquest as the language of diplomacy. And yet, beneath these changes, the deeper lesson of the Napoleonic era remained unresolved. The belief that order could be imposed through force had not disappeared. It had merely been refined, rationalized, and embedded within modern institutions. Napoleon's wars taught Europe that history could be accelerated, that crisis could be used to justify extraordinary power, and that society could be reorganized at speed if fear was great enough. This lesson did not die with him. It re-emerged whenever instability returned, whenever patience felt too costly, and whenever restraint was portrayed as weakness. The names changed. The uniforms changed. The logic did not. In this sense, Napoleon became less a historical figure than a reference point. He embodied the moment when ambition, efficiency, and violence fused into a single governing principle. To remember him honestly is not to admire or condemn, but to recognize how easily societies can slide toward accepting the unacceptable when uncertainty dominates public life. Part 13 exists beyond chronology. It asks the viewer to step outside the comfort of distance and confront continuity. The past does not remain safely behind us. It travels forward, encoded in ideas about leadership, security, and necessity. Every age inherits these ideas, and every age must decide whether to repeat them. The Napoleonic era reminds us that the most dangerous transformations do not begin with tyranny, but with agreement. They begin when populations grow tired of complexity and accept simplicity in its place. When debate is replaced by urgency. When the promise of order outweighs the cost of conscience. This final part does not close the story. It deliberately leaves it open. Because history does not end with conclusions, it ends with choices. And the question Napoleon's age leaves behind is not about one man, one empire, or one century. It is about whether modern societies can recognize the moment when power asks too much, and whether they are willing to refuse it. The wars that once drowned Europe in blood are now memory. But memory, if unattended, fades into permission. And in that fading space, history waits not to repeat itself exactly, but to rhyme once again. When the film reaches its final moments, what remains is not the echo of cannon fire, nor the rhetoric of triumph. What remains is silence. A silence heavy with memory. A silence that asks the viewer to sit with what history often leaves behind, the cost that lingers after power has exhausted itself. Napoleon's era did not end with a moral resolution. It ended with fatigue. With nations drained of men, resources, and certainty. The structures he built collapsed, yet the habits they normalized endured. War had been accepted as a tool of governance, violence as a language of order, and human lives as variables in calculations far removed from the people who paid the price. This story does not seek to condemn Napoleon as a singular villain, nor to elevate him as an exceptional hero. It places him where history places all figures of immense power within a system that enabled his rise, rewarded his ambition, and tolerated his excesses until it could no longer bear them. The tragedy of the Napoleonic age was not only that one man wielded extraordinary authority, but that so many accepted the logic that made such authority seem necessary. In the quiet after the wars, Europe attempted to remember selectively. It preserved victories, celebrated reform, and built monuments to order. But beneath that surface lay the deeper memory of lost millions of lives disrupted, erased, or permanently altered. These memories did not demand attention. They simply waited, embedded in culture, cautioning future generations against the seduction of decisive power. Part 14 does not offer reassurance. It offers responsibility. It reminds us that history rarely announces its turning points in advance. They arrive disguised as solutions. They speak the language of necessity. They promise stability while quietly eroding restraint. And once restraint is gone, the return to it is never simple. As the screen fades to black, the question left behind is not about Napoleon, or even about Europe. It is about us. About how societies respond to fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion. About how easily complexity is abandoned when simple answers appear wrapped in authority. The age of Napoleon ended in exile and silence. But silence is not absence. It is space. Space for reflection. Space for memory. Space for choice. History does not demand that we repeat it. But it does demand that we recognize it, especially when it begins to feel familiar. This final section no longer belongs to Napoleon, nor does it belong entirely to 19th century Europe. It belongs to those who came after, to those who revisit history in a world that has changed its shape, yet still pulses with the familiar rhythms of power, fear, and the desire for control. When enough time has passed, history no longer overwhelms us through events themselves, but through the quiet repetition of patterns. Napoleon believed that history could be directed like a military campaign, that with sufficient will and sufficient force, the world could be compelled to move in a single direction. The greatest failure of his era did not lie in underestimating enemies, but in underestimating the moral and psychological costs society pays when war becomes a method of governance. Once violence is legitimized as a tool, it does not remain confined to its original purpose. It spreads into every layer of life, eroding the capacity of individuals and communities to regulate themselves. For today's audience, this story does not ask for sympathy toward a long-dead emperor. It asks for clarity. What made the Napoleonic era dangerous was not personal cruelty, but the fact that so many people, in so many circumstances, believed there was no alternative. When societies begin to accept the logic of inevitability, history often enters a closed trajectory, one in which major decisions are justified as necessary, while their consequences are deferred to the future. Part 15 exists as a final mirror. It does not reflect battlefields, but the way we read history itself. We search the past for heroes, villains, and moments of climax, because these images make stories easier to understand. Yet history becomes truly dangerous when it becomes too easy to understand. When every tragedy is reduced to a single individual, society quietly absolves itself of collective responsibility. Napoleon did not act in a vacuum. He was sustained by an age that feared chaos more than it feared violence, by a society willing to surrender absolute power in exchange for a temporary sense of safety. This lesson never grows old. At any moment of rising instability, the promise of swift order will always appear more appealing than the slow patience of law and dialogue. This extended conclusion does not end in pessimism, but in responsibility. History does not exist to leave humanity in despair. It exists to force more careful choices. If the Napoleonic era leaves behind one final legacy, it is the reminder that power becomes dangerous only when memory fades, and that peace is not preserved through silence, but through the constant vigilance of society. In the final moment of the film, there is no central character left on screen. There is only the viewer and history facing one another. And in that moment, the story truly begins again, not on the battlefield, but in how each generation chooses to use, limit, or refuse the power placed in its hands. Part 16 opens not to tell another story, but to pose a final question, the question every historical documentary must eventually confront. After emperors fall, after empires collapse, and after maps are redrawn time and again, who does history truly belong to? Does it belong to the names carved into stone monuments, or to the countless people who left no trace beyond their own absence? The Napoleonic era is often told as the story of an extraordinary individual. But when one looks long enough, slowly enough, it becomes clear that his power existed only because an entire system operated around him. Officials carried out orders. Generals executed campaigns. Societies accepted continuous mobilization. Neighboring states responded again and again with force. Napoleon did not stand outside history. He stood at the point where many collective choices converged and failed together to impose limits upon themselves. In this moment of quiet, what matters is no longer the analysis of another battle or another political decision. What matters is facing the truth that history is usually remembered through the faces of victors and the defeated, while most of humanity is remembered only through consequences. Farmers who lost their land, families who lost their children, cities that lived for decades under the memory of occupation, they hold no leading roles in history books. Yet they are the reason history must be told honestly. Part 16 therefore shifts its focus away from Napoleon and toward the viewer. Because every generation, whether it chooses to or not, becomes an inheritor of history. Institutions, laws, and fears are passed down, along with promises that this time will be different. But history rarely changes because of promises. It changes only when societies learn how to distribute power, accept limits, and keep memory alive. As the film reaches its final moments, there is no swelling music, no images of war. There is only the slow breathing of the present. A Europe that has learned many lessons but never enough. And a wider world where stories of order, security, and power continue to be told in new languages. Part 16 closes with a simple recognition. History is not a prophecy, but it is memory. And memory, when neglected, returns in the form of fate. The Napoleonic era ended long ago, but the question it left behind remains intact: whether humanity can learn to restrain power before power once again learns how to use humanity. Part 16 opens not to tell another story, but to pose a final question, the question every historical documentary must eventually confront. After emperors fall, after empires collapse, and after maps are redrawn time and again, who does history truly belong to? Does it belong to the names carved into stone monuments, or to the countless people who left no trace beyond their own absence? The Napoleonic era is often told as the story of an extraordinary individual. But when one looks long enough, slowly enough, it becomes clear that his power existed only because an entire system operated around him. Officials carried out orders, generals executed campaigns. Societies accepted continuous mobilization. Neighboring states responded again and again with force. Napoleon did not stand outside history. He stood at the point where many collective choices converged and failed together to impose limits upon themselves. In this moment of quiet, what matters is no longer the analysis of another battle or another political decision. What matters is facing the truth that history is usually remembered through the faces of victors and the defeated, while most of humanity is remembered only through consequences. Farmers who lost their land, families who lost their children, cities that lived for decades under the memory of occupation, they hold no leading roles in history books. Yet they are the reason history must be told honestly. Part 16 therefore shifts its focus away from Napoleon and toward the viewer. Because every generation, whether it chooses to or not, becomes an inheritor of history. Institutions, laws and fears are passed down, along with promises that this time will be different. But history rarely changes because of promises. It changes only when societies learn how to distribute power, accept limits, and keep memory alive. As the film reaches its final moments, there is no swelling music, no images of war. There is only the slow breathing of the present. A Europe that has learned many lessons, but never enough. And a wider world, where stories of order, security and power continue to be told in new languages. Part 16 closes with a simple recognition. History is not a prophecy, but it is memory. And memory, when neglected, returns in the form of fate. The Napoleonic era ended long ago, but the question it left behind remains intact: whether humanity can learn to restrain power before power once again learns how to use humanity. Part 17 is written as the final breath of the film. It does not seek to add more history, but to frame the entire story within a single feeling: the feeling that what has just been witnessed does not belong to a distant past, but continues to exist quietly in the present. In this trailer, history is no longer a sequence of events. It becomes a compressed current of memory, slowly moving toward the viewer. Napoleon appears not as an emperor, but as a question. A man who believed that order could be imposed through war, that individual will, if strong enough, could replace social consensus. The wars that drenched Europe in blood are not shown through numbers or maps, but through rhythm and imagery. Anonymous faces, empty fields, silent cities left behind after history has passed through them and created an absence that cannot be filled. The trailer does not speak of victory. It speaks of cost. It does not speak of glory. It speaks of exhaustion, the exhaustion of an entire continent. Each frame is constructed like a whisper, suggesting that history does not need to shout in order to be remembered. It only needs to be faced directly. When the music rises, it is not triumphant. It is the sound of memory, slow, heavy, and unavoidable. Part 17 closes with a question that is never spoken aloud, but resonates in the final cut. If a single individual could draw all of Europe into war in the name of order, then what prevents history from repeating itself when familiar conditions return? The trailer offers no answer. It places the viewer in the position of having to answer it not as a spectator, but as an inheritor of history. In the final frame, the screen fades to black. There are no gunshots. No symbols of power. Only a silence held long enough for the viewer to understand that this story does not end when the film ends. It continues to live in how people think about power, about war, and about the cost of believing that history can be controlled by a single will. PH letter 1 ES7N 18 voice over trailer QU letter 1 ED1C telp letter 1 ABF 90 JIK QUYIA letter 1 EC1 NINL letter 1 AF1 ED stroke letter 1 BGRO letter 1 EE3 ECNA letter 1 EDBE letter 1 EB1 NG MAO. NH letter 1 ECBP D letter 1 EAEF 1 NG AHAN CHR 1 IDR NEADM Dan Zen. NH letter 1 EA 1 C N letter 1 EC 1 N tier letter 1 EA Savine M. NH letter 1 ECBP Tim CH letter 1 EADM. GI letter 1 ECDNG Distroke letter 1 ECDC NAM. TR letter 1 EA7M letter 1 EB7 Sen CN letter 1 EF Trung. TI letter 1 EBF, TCH letter 1 EBF, Kong, Cao Trao, Trong, L letter 1 E, CBCHS letter 1 EED Chow Ao, Co NH letter 1 EEFNG, TH letter 1 EDDI, KH letter 1 EAF SEMA, TR letter 1 EADT letter 1 EF1 Kong D stroke, letter 1 B0, letter 1 EE3C, ZD letter 1 EF1 NGB letter E1 EB1 NG, TH letter 1 ECF, ATHU letter 1 EADNE. MB letter 1 EB1 NGA Inchi I letter 1 IAF EN Tran, Co N8 letter 1 E even G Con NG letter 1 B Airvow letter 1 EDDI Tin R letter 1 EB1 NGN letter 1 EBF UD stroke letter 1 EE7 Y acute Chai. Tate letter 1 EBF GI letter 1 E DBI S letter 1 EBDD PH letter 1 EA3 I Quidi stroke letter 1 EA7U. VACO N8 letter 1 EEFNGTH letter 1 EDDADD stroke letter 1 EA1 I Da Traucho 8 letter 1 ECD QUY letter 1 EC1 NLL letter 1 EF1 C letter 1 EA5Y. C letter 1 EAFT Han. B letter 1 EA3 ND stroke letter 1 EDA3 Chow Ao D stroke letter 1 ED5 IMO, Don Quan DC HUY letter 1 EC3 ND stroke letter 1 EA1 I Bok Kai H letter 1 ECF AA, Napoleon Bonaparte. M letter 1 ED9 T Theern T Quans letter 1 EF1. M letter 1 ED19 Hack KI letter 1 ANEBF NT TLE letter 1 EA10 TR letter 1 EADT T letter 1 EF1. Vala Trung Tam C letter 1 EE7 Emma A EA8 and EEFNG CU letter 1 UN ED9 CCC I letter 1 EBFN Dion HU 8 letter 1 ED9 Mouse letter 1 EAD AA3 M letter 1 ED9 TL letter 1 E5 C strokes Yout letter 1 ECBA. CHUY letter 1 EC3 NNH letter 1 ECBP CA letter 1 EADM Ukuon M later 1 EB7 T Bin C Vo Dan. Condistro Clater We 1 NGTR letter 1 ED1 G Than PH letter 1 ED1 Che. De Kong C8 letter 1 EC9 Lacao CHUY letter 1 EC7 Enva letter 1 EC1 Enet letter 1 EEFNG CHI letter 1 EBFNT letter 1 AFNG De Lacao CHUY letter 1 EC7 Enva letter 1 EC1 Kia. Hang TRI letter 1 EC7 U Sin Meter 1 EA1 NGB letter 1 ECBCU letter 1 ED1 NDI Kong Kong Hin HE letter 1 EA3 I via H letter 1 ECDL letter 1 EF1 ACA letter 1 ECDN. Mavai L letter 1 ECBCH S letter 1 EDD stroke letter 1 B0 letter 1 EE3CD letter 1 EABN D letter 1 EAFT Theologic CC letter 1 EE7AS letter 1 EE9C M letter 1 EA1NH. NHE lesser 1 EA1C Dang NH letter 1 EB9 Kong KH letter 1 EA3 I Han. Kai CHI letter 1 EBFN Tran, Tier letter 1 EDF Than Kong Size letter 1 EAE5 QU letter 1 EA3N TR letter 1 ECB. Kai TR letter 1 EADT T letter 1 EF1 D stroke letter 1 0 letter 1 EE3 ECC OPC D stroke laser 1 1 EB7 T B letter 1 EB1 NG Sung D stroke letter 1 EA1N. GI letter 1 EDB IH or 1 EA1 and D stroke letter 1 EA10 D stroke letter 1 EE9C B letter 1 EAAF D stroke letter 1 EA7 U Tan Pel I letter 1 EBFN C letter 1 EAAV T Nihon Waterloo Kalinongvang TR letter 1 ED1 NG. M letter 1 ED9 T D stroke letter 1 EBF C letter 1 EBF TR letter 1 ED7 ID letter 1 EADY. M letter 1 ED9 T stroke letter 1 EBF C letter 1 EBF FS letter 1 EE5 P D stroke letter 1 ED5 N Hung Kai letter 1 E9 C C letter 1 EE7 Anothai Kong N8 letter 1 ECBP Sate letter 1 8 M de letter 1 EA7 N. Hin letter 1 e either nh chow ao yern tin. B letter 1 ed9 fim nay kong h letter 1 ecfi Napoleon davai d stroke letter 1 ea 1 id stroke letter 1 ebfn dao. No h letter 1 ecfi chow ao da m letter 1 ea5 tj va no h letter 1 ecfi chung ta. Li letter 1 ec7u L letter 1 ecb ch letter 1 eedo letter 1 ef1 psi s letter 1 ef1 letter 1 edf L letter 1 ea1 I fia sao. Have letter 1 eabn dang L letter 1 eb7ng L letter 1 ebd c L 1 ed d stroke letter 1 0 letter 1 ee3 c a letter 1 eb7p L letter 1 ea1 1 man hin t letter 1 eda1 I. NH letter 1 ea1c D letter 1 eebng D stroke letter 1 d9t nj letter 1 ed9t. Cow chuy letter 1 ec7 n den lay letter 1 on ed1 I letter 1 ec1 tri letter 1 ec eon u D stroke letter 1 ea1 I Napoleon omnani letter 1 eaf ngcu letter 1 ed9 cchi letter 1 ebf n un hu letter 1 ed9 m mao chow ao. In European history, there are moments when order is not built through agreement, but through war. There are individuals who believe that, with enough will, the world must bow. And there are eras willing to grant them that power. Rapid cuts Europe's map changing colors, armies on the move, cannons firing. Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius, a builder of order, and the center of wars that drenched an entire continent in blood. The rhythm slows anonymous soldiers' faces, empty fields, burning cities. This is not only a story of victories. This is a story of cost. Millions of lives were swept away, not because they chose it, but because history was driven by the logic of power. The music rises slightly, never triumphant. When war becomes a tool of governance, when order is imposed at gunpoint, moral boundaries begin to dissolve. Rapid cuts Waterloo, St. Helena, an empty throne. An empire rises, an empire collapses, but its memory does not. The rhythm slows further. Images of a quiet Europe. This film does not ask how great Napoleon was. It asks what Europe lost, and it asks us whether history truly remains behind us, or whether it is still quietly waiting to be repeated. The screen fades to black. The music stops abruptly. The dark story of the Napoleonic Dynasty and the wars that drowned Europe in blood.